Welcome back, everyone, to the biopathic method. I want to give you a brief review. Body complexes are products, elements, or output-oriented objects, meaning that what science studies are body complexes. What mathematics studies are mind complexes through predicates, namely axioms, right? Axioms are predicates, properties are actually axioms in a metamathematical sense, considering axioms to be something beyond just, formal primitive assumptions which are defined. Anyway, science studies body complexes, mathematics and logic study mind complexes, but what studies spirit complexes? Well, religions attempt to do so, art, poetry, film, literature attempts to do so. However, we don't have a, shall we say, rigorous way to study spirit complexes, and furthermore, we disjoin body complexes, mind complexes, and spirit complexes. This is a fallacy. We have self-dual structures. These are body, mind, spirit complexes. Now, if we want to permute this self-duality between body, mind, and spirit, we get 6 sequences. Okay, we can actually structure these sequences according to evolutionary cycles. The first evolutionary cycle is the sequential activation of body, mind, spirit. Therefore, we can say that subatomic and atomic and inorganic complexes are the body complexes, are the incarnations of what we would call body, mind, spirit complexes. That particular sequence is appropriate to that evolutionary cycle. Now, mind, body, spirit complexes are those entities of the second density evolutionary cycle, which are not so much worried about, well, let's not metaphorically describe this too much, but they're not as worried about stability and more so worried about growth and reproduction. Those are the main imperatives of second density entities, beginning with cells and culminating with avian and mammalian and complex botanical organisms. Third density evolutionary cycle is composed of body, spirit, mind complexes, where bodies are parameterizing spirit and mind feedback, which is why human bodies are much more sensitive and capable of many different activities. And then we get into the fourth density evolutionary cycle, which is spirit, body, mind complexes, where spirit complexes are parameterizing body complexes, body, mind, spirit, body, mind feedback. And then we have fifth density entities, evolutionary cycle, which this is where things get extremely esoteric, but we can sequence this cycle in terms of mind, spirit, body complexes. Sixth density is spirit, mind, body complex. The inversion of the first density, which is body, mind, spirit complex. So these 6 sequences form a self-permutation on the 7th density limit level of syntax, which is what we would call the body, mind, spirit complex totality, right? It contains all sequences as self-permutations. And this, of course, seems esoteric. And of course, and if a medical doctor was listening to this, be like, what is this guy talking about? Well, we're dealing with a paradigm in which body complex driven causation from past to future is called mechanization, rather randomization from past to future, and mechanization from future to past, right? Mechanization is basically the idea that you can deterministically program and control a body complex based on stimulation, surgical treatment, gene therapy, and different, well, palliative and eliminative forms of care. And this, of course, mechanization interprets the body complex ailments and injuries as random with respect to the goals of the mind and spirit complex of that entity. Right? We discussed how if you get cancer or if you get ALS, then your goals of, being a lawyer or a doctor or getting, or moving to another country or whatever other goal you have, these higher order psychological goals would go out the window, and the cancer, as it were, does not care about those goals. It is not actually figuring into those goals and has nothing to do with those goals. Right? We would say that the mutations involved in, if the cancer was not caused by, cancer bacteria or some other non-genetic cause, proximate cause, we would say in all those cases that carcinogenesis had absolutely nothing to do with these higher order goals of wanting to be a lawyer, wanting to be a doctor, moving to another country, getting married, having children, and in fact, living a joyous or studious life. And so this is, the paradigm, as it were, when it comes to healing, right? We treat, we cure, we prevent. And that pretty much sums up the philosophy of medical science. Now, I don't want to denigrate. I mean, medical science has made incredible advancements in scanning, imaging, treating, operating, and saves many lives, and it allows for these individuals to experience, in fact, save my life, and it allows for individuals to experience a longer life, but it is vastly, vastly incomplete. And so is naturopathy, and this is why we've been, introducing biopathy for the benefit of everybody, and a lot of this language might seem foreign and non-intuitive and clunky, and other, undesirable attributes can be leveled at it. But what we have to understand is that our current state of awareness is such that we need this kind of language as training wheels until we truly internalize and crystallize the biopathic method. Just as our, bodies have to develop, and just as we have to learn empirical intuition and certain, regularities in our classical environment, having to do with, not touching hot surfaces and not, jabbing our body with pointy objects, and, letting ourselves fall over and bending our joints in unnatural ways. And all these things are, things that we now take for granted because we've taken enough time to internalize and crystallize those understandings. But in the end, what we need to understand is that this is going to happen with biopathy as well, right? And this is what doctors really, contrapathic practitioners are developing they're learning about inorganic chemistry and organic chemistry and cytology, histology, physiology. And of course, we don't divide these subjects in terms of scale, although they should be. They're usually divided in terms of, there's an anatomy of the cell, and there's an anatomy of organs, and anatomy of biological systems, and so forth. And then we just study the physiology, and there's a lot of things to get into there. But the point is, medical scientists or medical doctors are studying medical science in order to gain intuitions that they can use in conjunction with live data streams, which have to do with patients. This is what my sister does, an extremely complex role. And I don't want to make it seem as though I'm elevating myself above that. Not at all. Not at all. Okay, I'm quite passionate about updating it and introducing the next, installment. But this does not mean that I don't have extreme respect for doctors and nurses and nurse practitioners and physician assistants and all these individuals, right? So my gratitude goes to you. I wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for all these medical personnel. However, the philosophy of medical science is based on future to past mechanization and past to future randomization. And this is simply metaphysically incomplete. And so, what we need to do is update medical science in terms of parametric causation and programmatic causation, unifying them through terminal and non-terminal domains. The non-terminal domain is absolutely not included in the formulation of body complexes, right? We think of all the inputs and outputs of body complexes as physical. They are not just terminal in the sense of grammatical terminal expressions. No, they are not just grammatical terminal. I mean, we've discussed how a metaphysical formulation of body complexes would render them as states. Okay, a body complex is an ultra complex state. And the state would be a terminal element, for example, a terminal symbol in a terminal expression, which would be a sequence of states. The sequence would be causal in the sense that, the previous states influence successive states. However, the sequence is also a distribution of potentials, and that distribution has to do with the top-down programming of grammatical non-terminals into lower order grammatical non-terminals or syntactic forms that are non-sequential and we would say in a superficial sense non-deterministic, right? They're non-mechanical, but actually they're self-deterministic. And this is, when we start getting into how mechanization and randomization can be defined at, mechanization can be thought of as self-selection and randomization can be thought of as self-generation. These are the updates of these processes, these dual processes when they're self-dualized. And of course, we need body complex oriented syntax, namely physical syntax. We need mind complex oriented syntax, namely mathematical or logical mathematical syntax. And we need spirit complex oriented syntax, namely perceptual or qualio-perceptual syntax. And we also need a unifying, self-dualizing teleodynamical syntax, which we'd call the emotional syntax or the motivational syntax, which basically, well, we there's a lot to get into here, but let me just start off by saying that programmatic causation is an update of imperative and declarative forms of programming, right? Examples, the hallmark examples of such programming paradigms are functional programming, which is a form of declarative programming, and imperative and procedural programming, which is a hallmark of imperative programming. Now, imperative programming basically tells a computer system how to execute a given program. It focuses on the how. It focuses on a step-by-step, high control. It's basically a high control flow, explicitly trying to control the execution sequence of a programming. However, the functional programming is more difficult to debug because it has a low control flow, meaning that it's not trying to tightly sequence, trying to tightly sequence the execution of the program. And so this means that it's trying to not focus so much on the how, but on the what. What are the goals of that program, right? And so what we need to do is unite these two types of programming into parametric causation, that is imperative programming, and programmatic causation, that is functional programming. When you put them together, you get teleodynamical programming. That's what we call it, because it's dynamical. It has low control flow. Okay, it's not trying to tightly sequence everything. You can enter a command. You can enter an imperative that is not going to be sequenced adjacently. It can be sequenced in the sense that there are many sequences that are superposed on each other, and this is relevant to synchronicities and deja vu and how dreams can influence real life, or rather reveal certain aspects of real life, how we can get intuitions about what's going to happen in the future, how deep memories can inform and bypass many intervening memories to inform present states. Utility, okay, is teleological, but teleology is not static, has low control flow, which means that it is teleodynamical, okay? So there is a teleology that's imperative programming, basically. However, it is not deterministic, which is when we start getting into declarative programming, okay? It sets out goals and it sets out certain possible sequences, but the sequencing and the goal formulating, which are respectively, imperative and declarative programming, are determined by any given entity on an evolutionary cycle, with varying degrees, with ascendingly integrated forms of intelligence and consciousness, right? Where consciousness is a prerogative-oriented feature of intelligence. It's the valence of intelligence. We can say, perceptual valence of intelligence. All right, so now that I've rambled non-linearly and probably semi-unintelligibly, let's turn to a set of notes that I put together, titled very boringly, General Background. And it, begins with updating element, relation, operation, body, mind, spirit, product, property, process, or program, so as to basically show you that there are historical analogs of all these ideas. Charles Sanders Peirce, Immanuel Kant, many, many, many people, even John von Neumann. And there's so many people who have sniffed in this direction and have gotten a whiff of teleodynamical programming, but we haven't put it all together, right? And I'm not claiming to have put this all together. I mean, there are many, many people to whom I would have to tip my hat and say, well, this person helped here. I think we should just focus on the content instead of focusing on the individuals who produce the content. I mean, ultimately, what matters is biopathy and a new and refined mode of healing that can not just heal in order to alleviate pain and permit longer and healthier living, but heal in order to allow for enable learning on the part of the ailed and those surrounding selves that are experiencing the ailed individual. All right, so I'm not going to try to add too many addenda. This is pretty self-explanatory. It shouldn't be too technical, and it was written rather rapidly, sort of one go through. This is going to take the form of notes with light, accents here and there, which are the bold and underlined statements. All right, but anyway, we have Charles Sanders Peirce's ontological categories. Firstness, which is monadic experience, reflexive self-definitions, right? Body complexes or permit monadic experience. Then you got secondness, which is a dyadic reaction in Peirce's terms, but is really a symmetric description of defined elements, right? You've got an element and a complement. That's the simplest symmetric description, right? You've got yes and no, and the yes is the element, the no is the complement. Their symmetric description is the identification of the element in relation to, yet distinct from the complement. I mean, it couldn't be simpler, right? And thirdness is the triadic relationship between element and complement through the description and definition coupling that is getting interpreted in some way, right? We're interpreting the defined elements and their description as a model, okay, as a proto-model, as a kind of minimal model of existence, where existence is defined definitionally and descriptively. All right, so those are the embryonic germ layers of entire subsyntaxes, which, from a bottom-up evolutionary perspective, emerge as a direct recursive sequence in the context of imperative or procedural programming, but which, from a top-down evolutionary perspective, are programmed through a syntactic generalization of mutual recursion, which in turn inaugurates a generalization of functional programming, which is teleodynamical programming, or teleodynamic programming, however you want to say it. It's akin to, we're taking dynamical systems theory and we're basically interpreting a dynamical system non-mechanically and non-randomly. Self-deterministically interpreting dynamical systems leads to teleodynamical systems, and their processes are the executions of their programming, and of course the programming is discarnational, the executing is incarnational, forming discarnational incarnational cycles, which are the non-terminal and terminal cycles that we're engaged in right now, and which every level of our body is also engaged in, right? The nucleation of a cell, a quiescent cell divides, nucleates a new cell. The new cell performs, differentiates, performs a certain function, and then it goes apoptotic eventually, and basically dies. And that's an incarnation. We haven't understood that it also has a discarnation relating to its programming. Okay? So this applies to humans, this applies to cells, this applies to every single body complex that we've identified scientifically. All right, the simplest or base case of mechanical syntax is that of Boolean logic. And let me just check really quick that I'm actually... Okay, yeah. I recorded an entire video that somehow didn't register my audio. So I'm just trying to check that the audio is actually registering, because that was a 40-minute video that I'm now re-recording. All right. So Boolean logic consists of the primitive recursive functions and primitive recursive statements composed purely of truth-valued elements, right? And, or, and not are these primitive recursive functions. You can state them differently, right? Projection function, constant function, and successor function. And they produce primitive recursive statements, which we could call propositions in the sense of propositional logic, Boolean logic, and propositional logic, basically the same thing. Propositional logic has two more connectives. You know, you've got implication and biconditionality, but anyway, that's it can be reduced to Boolean logic. But its key ontological deficiency is that it is non-self-generative. Okay, so its functions, statements, or relations and elements are non-self-generative. But since propositional information is the simplest or base case of information itself, it is the easiest to self-dualize. Now, the CTMU supplements the syntax of Boolean logic with a space of self-generative statements, which we can call self-dual relations, a signature of self-generative elements, namely self-dual elements, which permits zeroth order closure. Notice that the standard mathematical definition of self-duality, which is the unique equivalence between an object and its dual or involution, giving rise to dual and self-dual functions, equations, graphs, spaces, categories, etc., that's preserved as a uniqueness criterion, right? Every single body-mind-spirit complex on any stratum or evolutionary cycle is unique and extends to a limiting meta-mathematical definition, which is the systemic equivalence, the systemic self-duality between the minimal defining properties of a propositional truth valuation, right? Basically a tautology, and the defining components of any language, including any meta-language, right? Where the element would be automorphic to the signature would be automorphic to the elements, relations would be automorphic to the space or the set of strings, if you like, and vice versa. And finally, the operations would be automorphic to the syntax, including the grammar. All right. This is the systemic self-duality that defines minimality and maximality in tandem. Rather than being a unique or unary case of duality, which is what mathematics considers self-duality to be, which is itself a binary case of symmetry, which is a finitary case. Symmetry is a finitary case of asymmetry, which is an infinitary case of structurelessness. Rather than that, systemic self-duality denotes the joint closure, minimization, maximization of zeroth order logic, namely base case logic, and infinite order logic as an inductive step, which renders information synonymous with self-generation. All right, now why are we giving you all this context? This is very far removed, very remote and abstruse with respect to biopathy and medical science. Well, the only reason we're doing it is because we need this high-level vantage to even interpret body-mind-spirit complexes in the context of medical science, right? Otherwise, we're still going to get stuck with, future-to-past mechanization and past-to-future randomization, with programming being, basically snuffed at every point, right? And incarnation-discarnation cycles being snuffed and many, many things, right? Teleodynamics itself. So through ontology, information about existence being automorphic to the uniting limiting function statement and element termed existence is closed under self-generation. Now, this next statement is difficult to read. I purposely phrased it rather clunkily so that you can really try to decipher it. But before I read it, basically what it means is that if you're going to declare a system closed without actually formulating its self-generation, in other words, if you're going to declare a system closed without being closed under self-generation, then you haven't even defined how the system opens. You haven't even defined how the system generates itself. Okay. And so that's akin to basically conflating the explanation of the logical possibility of formulating or generating a system, opening a system, with its outright exclusion. Now, that's obviously a contradiction, right? You can't explain something by excluding its explanation, right? And if you throw up your hands and say, well, science is never going to explain why anything exists, well, I mean, then we got to update the scientific method, right? In terms of the syntactic or teleodynamic method. Now, mathematical metaphysics implies that A, Peirce's firstness, secondness, and thirdness are none other than the primitive properties of reflexivity, symmetry, and transitivity. B, the joint definition, description, and interpretation of a signet. Definitions are element-oriented, descriptions are relation-oriented, and interpretations are operation-oriented of a signature syntax in space yields the model theoretic identity or systemic self-duality of zeroth order and infinite order structure. C, any appeal to minimality and maximality implies a systemic regress which terminates with the theorist recognizing that any theory or universe, any language or universe, are, quote, identical on the syntactic level. And D, the generalized syntaxes of definition, right? Physical syntax, description, mathematical syntax, and interpretation, qualio-perceptual syntax, which are united by the ETS or emotional or teleodynamical syntax, may be studied through either local individualization, right? Which is basically training wheels, right? We got to individuate them in order to understand their distinctions, but their distinctions double as connections. Therefore, we can also study them in mutual identification by global syntax, which would be the stratum distributive equivalence of their stratum relative attributes, attributors, and attributions, right? So, firstness basically generalizes to physical syntax. Physical syntax is composed of states. Okay, you should notice that physical syntax, all of these syntaxes include their semantics. Okay, semantics would be like an executive aspect of syntax, and syntax would be a programmatic aspect of semantics, where executions have to do with parameterizations, and the syntax would therefore be self-selective, right? You've got self-selective and executive, self-selective and generative. But they're composed of scaled, spatially scaled, temporally temps physical bodies, from atoms all the way to humans, all the way up to planets and so forth. These are ultra-complex states, right? You've got elementary and composite states. Those states instantiate scaled tense physical properties, and the scaled and tense physical properties are operated on and transform in linear time, as it were, through physical processes. Now, linear time gives way to non-linear/linear meta-time, if you like, through the LMS, the logical mathematical syntax, which is basically composed of structural bodies, namely theorems, which are adjoined as physical states, which we've been calling adjoint theorems. Adjoint theorems. And then you've got structural properties with the adjoint axioms. And then you have structural properties, which are the adjoint operations that can be described in a terminally confined sense as physical processes, but can be described non-terminally as structural processes, which is actually kind of interesting because processes are usually not defined as structures, right? And yet, they are. I mean, a process has to be structured, otherwise it's random. And if it's random, then we're either kind of disjoining different scales in a confused manner, or randomness, what it literally means, is structurelessness. So if you're talking about a structureless structure, then again, you're, caught in a contradiction, which is meaningless, which is basically the same as, division by zero, right? Or an undefined value output, etc. That's what a contradiction truly amounts to. All right, and now thirdness is basically taking the elements, relations, and operations of QPS and interpreting them as intentional bodies or qualia, qualities, namely the properties of qualia. Now you're perceiving me as a quali. I'm a quali, right? I'm perceiving this computer. I'm perceiving everything as a quali. Okay, I can study it as a body. I can decompose it to states. And what gets confusing is, well, the quali only correlates with its states, right? And it can't be reduced to them because we're bypassing the the structural correspondence between qualia and states, right? So this is an interesting, dualism that we can get into in a second. But anyway, we've got also intentional processes or qualitative dynamisms, and these are basically what compose the QPS. All right, now solving the hard problem of consciousness amounts to self-dually mapping elements of physical syntax into elements of QPS, qualio-perceptual syntax, through, crucially, the logical mathematical syntax. All right, now that's a very brief, compressed way of describing the research program that would follow from the solution or dissolution of the hard problem of consciousness. Right, we're confusing different strata of syntax, basically, right, and not actually bridging them properly. Now, concisely, while non-dualists are peeling away all qualitative specificity to experience firstness in a human organism, which is itself a higher order element, right, of physical syntax, That's, when somebody has content-free consciousness, basically what that means is that you are experiencing what an inorganic body complex would experience, right? You're approximating that using your higher order body. Cognitive scientists are peeling away all quantitative specificity to recognize the A, irreducibility of QPS-mediated interactions, namely qualia and qualitative dynamisms, and the necessary structural correspondence between qualia, namely QPS elements, and states, namely STOS elements. Okay. Now, the irreducibility of perceptions to states is an oh so subtle category error. We're not supposed to reduce, we're supposed to structurally correspond, right? When we de-restrict consciousness from metabolically driven waking attention, which is organization, and complexity specific, to input to output attribution, which basically applies to every single body there is, that's the defining property of STOS elements, whether they're quantum mechanical, quantum chemical, biochemical, cytological, histological, organological, etc., then we can start to really work with a generalized form of panpsychism. Now, a human organism, recognizing the non-dualistic state of firstness, whether by meditation or by trance, is approximating the conscious state of finer or lower order STOS elements existing in homeostasis and homeoresis, which is structural or dynamical equilibrium. Right, again, that's back to a human experiencing content-free consciousness. That is the reason why there's a valence of serenity, is because that serenity is none other than the structural and the dynamical equilibrium of an inorganic complex, such as a table, such as a piece of metal, right? That's the consciousness of an advanced first density entity. Okay. Now, a human organism such as a scientist, which is metacognizing the irreducible structural correspondence between firstness, namely STOS elements or states, and thirdness, namely QPS elements or qualia, through secondness, namely LMS theorems, okay, which are the states or the bodies of, or the qualia of the logical mathematical syntax, is dissolving / correcting the category error known as the hard problem of consciousness. However, one has not yet converted the correction into a new research program whereby physical syntax appropriate to definition, okay, mathematical syntax appropriate to description, and qualitative or qualio-perceptual syntax appropriate to interpretation are updated in terms of body-mind-spirit complexes, right? Whose operators, operands, and operations are all self-dual, right? Now, this is back to, recalling that self-duality is a unique mathematical property, but it's also a systemic ontological property. And therefore, all of these I'm skipping a little bit here. All of these subsyntaxes are systemically self-dual, not just uniquely self-dual internal to each other, right? The elements and relations and operations of each of these subsyntaxes are self-dual intrinsically, but they're also systemically self-dual to the ETS, which basically is the emotional, motivation, or teleodynamical stratum of syntax, right? Where the objects, states, bodies, or theorems are emotional qualia or emotions. The relations are emotional qualities, right? The properties that are instantiated by the emotions proper, and the emotional or motivational processes are the actual teleodynamical programs that are run, that are executed by QPS and then by LMS and then by STOS, but not in sequence per se, right? But the reason why we're, getting into this is so that we can more fluidly discuss, for example, my experience of bacterial pneumonia in terms of teleodynamization, which I have to add to the dictionary here. Okay, now I'm going to let you read this, so you can pause the video and read this. I'm not going to read it right now. This video is getting a little too long. Let me just say that physical syntax is all about elementalization, right? You're converting elements, namely bodies, to state-wise distinguishable structures from the perspective of LMS, which is relation-oriented, quantitative structural properties, right? And of course, then QPS, is operation-oriented, right? Oriented, meaning something, it has a primary, secondary, and tertiary type of focus, but just because it's oriented in a certain way doesn't mean that it's, only, sort of controlled by that, right? Ultimately, every single level of syntax has intrinsic aspects and systemic aspects. And the systemic aspects are covered by ETS teleodynamization, okay, which is where STOS elements function as definitional parameters, LMS relations function as descriptive predicates, and QPS operations function as interpretative processes. Now, of course, those are the primary. It basically takes each of these subsyntaxes as entire arguments, right? As teleodynamical arguments, right? As objects, as inputs, outputs, throughputs, right? And teleodynamizes them, meaning it registers and imbues each with utility. Okay, and the utility is defined by the valence of all utility is emotional in a receptive sense and motivational in a projective sense or executive sense. Okay, a lot more to come soon about this. Now, what this gives, teleodynamical programming involves proto-computation, which is a non-mechanistic it's a non-mechanistic generalization of hypercomputation. And, that's because hypercomputation is technically still mechanical, right? It's mechanical in the sense that it's basically considering infinity to be a static mechanical structure. And the only reason that we can't instantiate hypercomputation is because it involves infinity in a literal sense, whereas, classical computation, parallel computation, quantum computation, all basically involve finite executions, right? It's basically the distinction between unbounded but finite memory and infinite memory, right? Unbounded just means that you can always add more memory. You can always, you take a physical machine, you can always extend its memory. You can always add more capacity to it, making it more capacious. But it's still a physical machine. It's a finite object, right? When we start talking about infinite objects, it's like, well, what even is that, right? That doesn't seem like a coherent. We can only consider them to be like static transcendental objects, but because they're static, they're technically not. We're missing the utility and we're missing the dynamism, right? So mathematics as it stands, being static, albeit infinitary, misses the teleodynamization of existence, right? It misses it. That's why axioms are not generated or programmed on the basis of their utility. That's not why they're not proven, right? Theorems don't figure into physical reality. We don't consider states to be the transient components of adjoint theorems, which would be the constant components. A lot to get into here, right? And it seems remote. It seems like it doesn't bear on biopathy, but I promise you that it does. And it also seems very unintuitive and overly complicated. It's not. Okay? The only reason things seem more complicated when you break into them and are trying to sort of manage all the chaotic variables. But once you start to classify and organize the variables, then they start to fall perfectly into place. And that's, when we start talking about unique or intrinsic self-duality and systemic self-duality and programmatic causation from the top down and parametric causation from the bottom up, respectively corresponding to teleodynamization and mechanization, right? And, again, the reason why there's a lot to get into here, but before I close the video, the reason why we tend to mechanize medical science, tend to mechanize our understanding of medicine through the scientific method is because the scientific method is itself a kind of mechanical process, right? It basically states that, either things are deterministic or they can be classified as random. And what science does is it basically classifies most dynamics as random, stochastic dynamics, and mechanistic structure. Okay. And it gets interesting here when we start talking about structure versus function in biology. And I'll leave that there. All right, so I hope this wasn't overwhelming or overloading you, and I hope that you're ready to begin recruiting this language on the fly to begin describing real life circumstances. For example, and I'll do this in the next segment, my life-threatening pneumonia. So thank you so much for listening and have a beautiful day, everyone.